Hello.
Hello.
Welcome. I'm Bartholomew Bland, the Executive Director of the Lehman College Art Gallery, and I'm very happy to be joined today by Dannielle Tegeder, Professor of Painting in the Lehman Art Department. And Dannielle, I would say, safe to say, is one of our most distinguished faculty. And I am a great fan of her painting. I've seen it in a number of different venues. And so I'm very pleased that she could join us today to talk a little bit about creativity, her insights, and how she became an artist, how she sort of transformed into an artist.
Great, Bart. Well, thank you for having me. And we're very happy to be connected to the gallery and so forth. So it's been wonderful having you on over a number of years.
Thank you, thank you. I thought we might go back, as they say, to the beginnings, the very beginnings. Now, you were raised in Peekskill, New York, about an hour north of the city. And I wanted to ask you, I often ask this to artists, what is the first kind of work of art that you remember as a child sort of having an impact on you?
Oh, work of art that I remember. That's a good question. So I grew up in a working class family in upstate, and my family was originally from the Bronx, from Pelham Bay, and then they moved up a little further where I was born. And they were, my mother was a nurse and my father was a steam fitter, and we were not around any art really, but there was an incredible sense of craftsmanship that my father employed, and most of my family are steam fitters, so there was a lot of kind of very beautiful mechanical drawing that they were trained in, welding, and there was a great sense of craftsmanship and really art. My mother was a nurse, and she was actually a night nurse for the Wallaces. And the Wallaces were the founders of the Reader's Digest, and they were major art philanthropists and founded wings at the Met and many other things. So I would go with my mother to work sometimes, and it was the Wallaces' private home, which was an incredible kind of post-impressionism. Most of it was donated to the Met, incredibly. So I do. Those are probably my first works of art. Both of those things.
That's very interesting. That was Lila Atchison Wallace.
That was Lila Atchison Wallace. She was her private nurse when I was growing up.
How fascinating! Yes, that's a.
So I did go there, and of course their house was amazing. Museum
stuffed with art, I imagine. Yes,
amazing pieces. Some of the best in the world.
So that was a real contrast with the steam fitting, and of course that's one of the things I find most fascinating about your work. What's the name of the painting you're sitting in front of actually right now?
Interesting, this painting, and I've been going through my archive in the studio. This painting is about 20 years old, so I took it out. I'm going to photograph it, and I'm going through the history of my painting and archiving things.
I'd imagine you've had time to reflect quite a bit in the last few months.
I have, for the first time, for most of us during the quarantine period. And yeah, I mean, you can see behind me, and I'll also, send in some images. Just there's a real diagrammatic quality, and the work is really inspired out of architectural plans, mechanical drawings, aviation maps, different types of mapping. And the level of drawing in the paintings really does kind of, come from my family, really.
When you describe your father doing these steam pipe fittings, were you ever with him on the sites, or were you at home looking at the renderings that he was doing?
Well, I did it all. So, I grew up as an only child, and I would wake up, and my father or my uncles, they would be finishing the drawings, which were quite beautiful drawings. This is well before we started doing them on the computer. So we would do it, and then I would go, and it was the 70s, so I was allowed to go on all these construction sites, and a lot of them were in the Bronx and in Yonkers, and I would sweep the floors, but they would really weld these systems, and that really stayed with me and influenced me, because I think of it almost as the interior architecture or secret systems of the building. So I grew up on a lot of open walls and these systems being installed
Interesting.
in a very beautiful way.
Yes,
You
yes.
know.
Did you receive in your sort of grade school education? Did you take art classes that impacted you very much,
I
or?
took art classes. I always took art classes, and I always was going to be an artist. I mean, I won most artistic in high school, um, but I guess my idea of being a professional artist, like I didn't know. I had never met a professional artist, and so I had my own business called Dannielle's Designs when I was a teenager. And I was an artist. I made your business card or your logo, and I made strange paintings in my bedroom as a teenager. And I really just didn't know about the world of being a professional artist. So I had a little bit of a couple other dots to cross before I ended up
Yeah.
um, going to art school.
Were your parents pleased with the sort of creativity sort of coming out in you, or were they looking for you to
That's
do
an
it
interesting question.
practical?
I teach a lot of students whose parents are very resistant to them studying art. And I know that's a really common theme of parents being just appalled that their children are going to art school. My parents had not gone to high school. They went to trade school. And so I always say, like, the benefit of coming from a working class family is like they just didn't know that it was a bad idea. Or like there was no resistance. I mean, absolutely. I was the first one to go to college in my family. They were ecstatic and supportive the whole way through that for me, even
Is
though
that
that was a very foreign experience for them.
Yes. Is that why you decided on SUNY Purchase, that it was well known for its arts programs?
Yeah, I mean, Purchase was, not far from where I grew up, and it was an excellent, excellent art school. And I have to say, looking back, was probably one of the best decisions that I made. I mean, it was an amazing interdisciplinary program. So I lived with musicians, dancers, choreographers, filmmakers. There were 6 conservatories. Very unusual to have an experience like that.
And of course, an excellent college museum there with the Newberger.
Newberger was an amazing collection. I went in almost every single day, and there was these amazing Cleve Gray paintings. And I would write to Cleve Gray, actually, and he would write me back.
Really? Oh, that must have been.
And I would say, I'm an art student at SUNY Purchase, and he would write me back about his life and the paintings. So it was really a great education. And then I went on to the Art Institute of Chicago for my MFA.
And did you do that? Did that quite quickly. I mean,
I
was there?
did. I joined the Peace Corps in between. So I went to Ghana. I was in the Peace Corps after undergraduate, and then I went to Chicago.
And was that a big? Well, I mean, if you had gone to college in Westchester, leaving for Ghana must have been quite a shock to your system.
Yeah, no, I left for the Peace Corps, and it was the first time I really had been out of the country, and so it was quite a out of the country experience. Moving to West Africa. And I was in a class talking about this last night. I actually taught a class at SUNY New Paltz as a visiting artist, and I went to India for a year after my MFA, and I was saying how those experiences were so important to me, as much as 7 years of art school.
Really?
Just, yeah, absolutely. Just like being informed about the world and geography and politics and the role of an artist in different societies, and how that it's one thing to know that intellectually, it's something else to see it and experience it. So I have a soft spot for Ghanaians. It was really an amazing time.
Interesting, interesting. So while you were in the Peace Corps, you applied and got into the Art Institute at Chicago. And so how was that different from Purchase in terms of its program?
Completely different. I mean, it was a full art school. It was a competitive MFA program. So we were all very competitive. Purchase was as well. But it was a short, concentrated period of time, the way graduate school is. I had never lived in
Or much more in some ways focused, right?
very focused, very independent. You were in your studio. We had amazing visiting artists. So I had Amy Silman, Joanne Greenbaum, Jerry Saltz. They would bring people in from New York. All the Chicago Imagists, were my professors, which was really interesting. And being in Chicago is also a very different art world than New York. There was a lot of artists, especially at that time, major artist run spaces, which Chicago is really famous for, and still is.
Of course.
So it was a very different art scene. I stayed there for a long time. I stayed there for about 8 years.
I was going to say, were you tempted to
I did.
there?
I had a giant loft on North Avenue, and I was able to cocktail waitress very little and paint all the time. And I stayed for that, really. And for a long time. And I came back to New York. I got the Marie Walsh-Sharp program, which was a free studio. And I had been wanting to come back to New York anyway. And so that's how I came back.
Made the transition back. And what year was that?
In 2000.
In 2000. And you had done academic postings. You had been at Cornell, is that right?
Yeah, so I taught in many places. So I was a professor at Hofstra. I taught at SUNY Purchase for 7 years as an adjunct. And then I taught at Cornell as a full-time kind of replacement professor.
Right.
And that was really my first full-time teaching position.
And then how did you end up coming to Lehman?
It's an amazing story. They say no one gets a job off of CAA. It was, I had been teaching a lot, and I really, my goal was, I knew that I needed to, I wanted a full-time teaching position, and I applied off of CAA, essentially.
Wow. That's great. Yes, it's
yeah.
Do you remember the first class that you taught? I mean, that must have been that's a sort of a seminal moment, isn't it, when you go from being the student to the teacher?
The first class ever?
Yeah.
I do. I taught at the Art Institute of Chicago in the early college program, and in graduate
school. Grad student, or after you had
Yeah, they gave me something called the roving TA, which I always thought was kind of a hilarious title, like you're raving or something. But it
sounds like Girl Reporter or something.
It was kind of fun because it was any professor, and the school is just enormous. It was any professor that was sick, you would actually be called in to teach their class. So like one day I'd be in figure drawing, and the next day I'd be in printmaking, and then I'd be in sculpture, and then I'd be in experimental conceptual installation class. So it was fun. It was very good training because I really had to think on my feet, and I'd get a call and I would just kind of go and cover their classes.
Oh, that's great. It's sort of exposure to a myriad of styles and periods.
Absolutely. And some of them were just like really very interesting professors. So it was fun to get to kind of step into their class.
Wonderful. And through all of this, the through line of your work, and because of course I've as I've said, I've seen your work in a number of different venues. I have thought about the historical relationship to some of the precisionists and some of the industrial work that was done in the early 20th century. Did that remain constant for you? Did you veer away from it when you were, say, for instance, in India, and start doing very different kinds of work and then return? Or was that always a sort of
looking back, some of my early work was certainly looser, and it was the 90s, and I was really influenced by people like Kiki Smith, was huge, and it was the height of the AIDS epidemic, and I was an AIDS educator. I actually went, and I was making these organic systems. They almost had body parts and things like that, and I had always been really interested in medical illustration, things like that. So looking back, I always was interested in abstraction. Right. From a very young age. I can remember that at Purchase. I just thought, wow, this is so interesting to me. And I can see, I was making these systems, but they were organic systems. So they slowly, I would say, through graduate school.
Were they more biomorphic in nature?
They were totally biomorphic, completely.
Okay.
Yeah, and then it really shifted and became more informed by architecture, my family background, modernism. I love that you connected to the precisionists, actually. I usually think of like Malevich and Lisitsky, but of course, like the precisionists as well. And I think there's also a real kind of American industry and working class.
Well, I definitely think of that sort of between the wars period.
Really interesting, yeah.
I look at your work, that's the kind of thing. But of course, that's one of my real key areas of interest. So you're always making those relationships between things. I'm interested in terms of the hand as it appears in your work, because it's so mechanical. Have you, and I know that you tape up a lot of your paintings and the lines are put in very carefully by hand. Is it important to you to keep that element of the hand? Have you toyed with I don't know, in things like printmaking? It would seem they'd be sort of natural, and I know you've done some of that, but a natural
I've done some printmaking.
reproduction. Yeah.
I think that I still make paintings and drawings because I'm interested in the hand in my work. And, I always say like my work is digitally inflected, meaning that the space that you're looking at almost looks like it was digitally generated. I think that's one of the really interesting things about painting now, how contemporary painters are being influenced by how we see space digitally. I think that hasn't really happened before, so, but, when you get close to my work, there's drips, there's the paint textures, there's the surface quality, there's little tiny mistakes of the process. And for me, that's what kind of humanizes this very almost digital kind of industrial system. So it's important for me that that stays in there in some way.
It's very interesting because I've been to your studio several times, and it's very different looking at your work online. I mean, every artist's work is translated that way, but the online with the flattening and the flattening nature of it sort of amps up that more sort of digital atmosphere. And then when
when you're seeing it online, of course it becomes very slick, right? And you don't see some of those nuances. You also don't see surface as much because it just completely cancels it. But in some level they're about the process of painting, so, and the formal qualities of abstraction. So so the drips and the surface, the shine, you can see behind me, there's like a metallic next to a very matte red. So those moments are important to me to keep.
So something, a quote I saw from you, and you were talking about the works, and one of the inspirations is being urban planning and this idea of systems. I was really taken by that, with that, and how urban planning and the kinds of systems that you've been inspired by really demand a kind of societal organization. And I know you work with abstract work as systems. I mean, I think we're looking at the challenge of systems in so many things, including New York City right now, and this kind of fear that there are systems breaking down, that there are organizational systems, crisis on the MTA and that kind of thing. Does that sort of bleed into your work? And I mean, have you been?
Absolutely. I would say, you asked before about the process moving from those organic systems to these more architectural systems. And I had my first show in New York in 2001. So, right after 9/11, I was back in the studio and I had to make drawings for this exhibition. It was my first exhibition at New York, and I started making these, in a way, utopian, or they were secret cities, they were underground plans. All of them had a horizon line on top. And so they were, and I do think of them still as almost these fictional architectural spaces or utopian cities. And they're always devoid of people. I can't tell if that's post-tragedy or before tragedy. They're either awaiting a catastrophe and so it's interesting being back in an emergency in a way and thinking about those systems of how you move around a city and how it ruptures, like what you're talking about. And I'm very interested in systems in general in cities. And of course there are like physical manifestations of that, but there's also poetic metaphors of how are we all connected living in a city.
Is the sublime.
Some of those invisible sublime systems, absolutely.
So when you sort of touched on what was going to be my next question, which is you weren't sure when you were looking at these utopian cities whether they were about to be destroyed, whether they were perfect because people hadn't sort of invaded to sort of bring their imperfections into this perfect design. Are you essentially an optimist about kind of utopian ideas and dreams, or do you have?
I mean the real essence of utopia is that it becomes a dystopia. It cannot sustain itself. And so I do think there is, in a way, a utopian impulse in the work, the way there was with utopian architecture and, other safe cities and
Failed utopian planning.
There is an optimism in that, absolutely. But I will say there's always a failure in that because utopias fail. So there is a failure.
Dystopian element.
I'm interested in the idea of failure anyway. I always say that I would make a horrible architect or steam fitter because I'm very interested in cities that cannot be built. They're so utopian they cannot be built. They're failing in some way or things like that. So systems that are so unimaginable in a way. They're not literal practical. They're not practical systems.
When you go back to your father's work, I mean, was he concerned with things like the amount of pressure that could be put on these steam pipes and the failure of them that could be catastrophic in many?
Absolutely, it was incredibly dangerous, and I still have it embedded in me that my father would say, "Okay, when we pour a glass of water through this part of the system, where does it go?" He would say to me, "Where does it go in the system?" And I would have to point out, like in the mechanical drawing, where it went. Which system was what. And so in a way they are alive to me and that they are working systems in a sense, definitely.
Have you been down into the steam rooms at Lehman College?
I've never been, but I have to do that.
I would love to go with you sometime.
That'll
be our dream when the campus is back.
That's going to be our thing to look forward to.
Yeah. It's
I've heard about it and I've never been.
Yes, and of course those plants have been running. I've thought about that when we were sort of in this sleeping campus mode back in March when all this happened. Someone was manning those 24/7.
It's kind of amazing.
Going. You have to do that. There's never really a complete turn off of this system. So.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? I love the way this campus devoid of a presence where there is almost like the heart of all those systems. And I have a symbol in my work. It was called the love dot boiler. And that would provide love to this whole system that was devoid of people and things. And so this idea of a ghost campus being empty with just that system there in a kind of secret place really appeals to me.
Yes, it's very powerful. I was at the campus a couple of weeks ago in the late summer, and I was out on the quad, and I was the only person sort of within visible, and it does take on a very strange dystopian, like I've seen this movie before, kind of.
Well, it just also just makes you so much more aware of architecture and your relationship. Bodily to buildings and space, and we've been having that experience in New York. Just walking around during the quarantine of things being completely empty.
Of course. And of course, we have our beautiful Marcel Breuer building that we live and work in
Building.
there. And I know you've done, a number of years ago, you did a piece specifically inspired by Marcel Breuer that was on view at the gallery.
I did. I did a wall drawing in the gallery, and I do often pause when I'm teaching in that building and just think like how absolutely lucky we are to be teaching in that space. And also for me, it's so connected to things that I'm really interested in,
Yes, and I
that
can see
type of architecture. And yeah, amazing.
something very soaring about it. I mean, literally and metaphorically, that is very uplifting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to do something again. I mean, I feel like I really have to think even, even more site specifically with that building.
Yes, well, that
Absolutely.
would be wonderful. Maybe we'll come back for one of our.
Yeah, it's really inspiring, definitely.
Uh, Very good. Well, I will say thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful having this
Thanks,
conversation
Bart.
with you. And I hope that I will see you again on campus very soon.
I hope so too. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.